Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome you to the second meeting of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill Committee. Can I welcome our members and our audience, and can I remind all present to turn off, not just on silent mode, all mobile phones and BlackBerry type devices. Thank you. I understand we have no apologies from MSPs this morning. Is that correct? Thank you. And we have no additional MSPs asking to join us. Can I take us to agenda item 1, which is to take item 3 on the consideration of the evidence and the contents of the preliminary stage report in private. Can I ask members if we are agreed on that?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Can I now turn to agenda item number 2? And the committee will be taking evidence in the bill at the preliminary stage from the first panel, the Right Honourable Sir George REID, who was the author of the Strategic Review of the National Trust for Scotland. I welcome Sir George to the meeting, and I understand, George, you would like to give us an opening presentation.
Yes, thank you, Convener. It's pleasant to be back at Holyrood, and with your permission, I'll make a short scene-setting statement. The bill before the committee is the final milestone in the process of reform and revitalisation of the National Trust for Scotland, as laid down in my strategic review. In reality, the bulk of the 23 key recommendations have already been actioned and on time. That was possible because Schedule 2 of the 1935 Act gives NTS the power to make its own regulations. This bill, therefore, is simply about codifying the reform process and giving effect to recommendations which are inconsistent with current legislation. Of all the strategic reviews I've done, and I've done quite a number now, this was in some ways the easiest and in some ways the most difficult. It was conducted according to the capability methodology developed by the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. That asks fit-for-purpose questions. Vision, what are you actually for? Resources, what have you got? Objectives, where do you put your money and your people to maximum effect? Outcomes, how are these to be measured and reported? In 2009, there was no strategic plan in the National Trust for Scotland. Finance was disbursed on a pure needs-must basis, sometimes by raiding the piggy bank. And it was perfectly clear that the trust was not sustainable if it continued in that fashion. The question, of course, was why the organisation was in such a state. And the answer I give is simply like Topsy, it had just growed and growed and growed. It had accumulated money and assets without ensuring that they were adequately endowed to cover hefty maintenance and repair costs. It had the most grossly inflated governance structure in the Scottish charity sector. 87 trustees split, and I use that word advisedly, between the council and the board, a culture which encouraged division, duplication, delay, uncertainty, and friction. That analysis was the easy bit. What was more difficult in an organisation where everybody wanted to have their say all the time was to build support for radical reform. It couldn't be done to the 300,000 members. It had to be done with the 300,000 members. Hence, a massive programme of engagement, participation, consultation, 32 presentations by me throughout the country, several hundred meetings, a wide range of consultative forums, 3 of which were held in this Parliament. It was worth it. In September 2010, the Trust's AGM endorsed the whole reform process by 424 votes to 2. In March the following year, the new board took on their prime strategic duty, which in capability methodology is defined as igniting passion, pace, drive, and focus. Finally, it's worth considering where the Trust was in 2009 and where it is today. Then no common vision or strategic plan. Now an agreed statement of purpose to conserve and promote our heritage, and an integrated plan for its delivery across the whole organisation. Then a Byzantine structure of governance, 50 trustees elected by the members, 35 representing outside organisations, 100 external advisors. Now a 15-strong board which has ultimate responsibility, which can be held to account, and which doesn't try to micromanage staff. A structure fully endorsed by Oscar. Then, under a miserable £4 million in the reserves, today the target of £21 million of reserves already achieved. And I was always clear, by the way, that donations and legacies would come if the Trust would just put its house in order. Then no common inventory of the Trust's treasures. Today that work is completed. I could go on, Convener. I simply note that in my view it's quite remarkable that Ken Calman and Kate Maver have achieved so much in such a short period of time. There is a new sense of common purpose throughout the organisation. The bill before you completes the process of governance reform, but it's not, the end of the challenges facing the National Trust for Scotland. An inventory of assets done is not an audit. The Trust, by the end of this year, will complete its property portfolio review, stating the significance of each asset and the costs of its maintenance. There'll be some hard decisions to be made on the far side of that process. All I can say is that the Trust now has a governance structure which it certainly didn't in 2009, which is fit to address these challenges. Finally, and purely personally, when I took on the review, it was because I believed passionately that it's the land of Scotland which shapes us, the special places in Scotland's story, where our history is unfolded, which gives us a feeling of belonging, that our inheritance from the past is what moulds our identity, which gives us a sense of belonging today and in the years to come. Convener, I commend the bill to the committee.
Thank you very much, Sir George. An excellent summary for us of the process you've been through and also of what's been happening since your review, which I think is important. I think you've kind of answered my questions, but can I just clarify them for the record? Are you absolutely supportive of the general aims of the bill? But at the same time, are there any aspects of the bill that you think could be strengthened?
No, I think, as I say, the bulk of the work is done, and that was open to the Trust under Schedule 2. So it was possible to shrink the board into the Council. It was possible under the recommendations to remove the representative members and to get it down to a body of 50. Done. And we don't need new legislation for that. At the end of the day, there are 5 issues which are before the committee. That completes the governance structure. And I think you then have a codified structure which is fit to meet the challenges of the future.
Excellent. So given that, you don't think there are any further reforms that will need future legislation?
There are a number of operational issues coming, but that's a matter for Ken Calman and others. The only job I had to do was recognising the very substantive challenges in the heritage structure, was to put in place a form of governance backed by Oscar which could address these challenges. And I have to say to you, Convener, if some of the challenges facing the Trust had been before the previous governance structure, it would have been a pagaille. The body was not fit to address these issues in consultation with members and others. In my judgment, it is now.
Thank you very much. That really sets the scene for us. As you said, there are 5 sections to the bill now. Each of our members are going to take us through different sections. Can I turn to James Dornan?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Sir George. Nice to see you again.
To you, James.
I've got a couple of questions about the roles of presidents and vice presidents. In your review, you felt it was inappropriate for the president and any vice presidents of the trust to be party to the decision-making of the Board of Trustees and recommended they should adopt a more impartial role. Since 2011, the president has taken on this new ambassadorial role informally. Are you content that this interim measure has operated effectively?
Yes. In reality, you have a neutral figure, but you've got to get that right in legislation. The basic structure behind the reorganisation is that the governors, the Board of Trustees, have ultimate authority. Management gets on with management, so there's a clear distinction. I should remind you that the 4 directors, senior directors of the Trust, were previously on the board, and that's wrong because they had to scrutinise themselves. So in terms of scrutiny, the structure is right. You always need, though, in an organisation of this type, a guardian of the sacred flame, the sort of role presiding officers aspire to in this Parliament, people who are neutral, impartial and trusted as such, people who can arrange and fix things quietly on the side. And I think it would be quite wrong for the President to have due diligence functions as a trustee. You need a friend, a neutral, outside the structure, who will chair the AGM, and that is why it's proposed as it is. It's common in a large number of charities.
Yes. Okay. You also recommended the creation of the new post of Honorary Vice President to ensure the Vice Presidents are not subject to the same liabilities as charity trustees. Do you think that there will continue to be a role for Honorary Vice Presidents at the Trust if the bill is passed, or should the posts be disbanded?
There is a role with discretion for Vice Presidents, but they should not be part of the management governance of the Trust. And if you take the proposal here, it makes provision, going back to the 35 order, for them to be honorary only. Scotland's a very diverse country, both in geography and sections of interest. And I think, in my view, in terms of binding the Trust together, it's not unhelpful to have people who are available to go and congratulate volunteers, people in remote parts of the country. That's good for the morale of the organisation, a job for an honorary vice president, and also to bring specific interest, be it in terms of areas of natural beauty or heritage. That's the job for them, but it's not the job to govern and it's not the job to manage. It's honorary.
Okay, right, thanks very much.
Thank you. Are there any supplementaries to James's questions? I have one, and again, just for clarification, given what we've just talked about, the section 125 of the Act, or the bill, which says the Council must prescribe and may amend the individual duties and responsibilities of the President and those of each of the any Vice President. Does that, in law, satisfy what you hope to achieve from the President and Vice President roles?
Yes. Most of what's been done since 2010 can be done within Schedule 2, but there are areas where, to give effect to the proposals, you do need to make legislative change.
Thank you very much. Can I turn to Jamie McGregor? Thank you.
Sir George, a couple of questions on co-opted members. Your review supported the Trust's ability to co-opt up to 4 charity trustees. However, would you say it's fair, is it fair to say that the review was not overly concerned about the restriction in the 1935 order whereby co-opted members can only serve for 1 year on the basis that such members could be re-elected?
Oh, that does concern me. Why would somebody of significant skills, experience and reputation take a job on for a year, right? The basic principle here is that the 10 elected trustees represent the broad range of skills and interests of members. Like any board, you'll come to a situation and say, what are we short of? If you look at the input of Ian Percy, for example, in the finance sector, he was enormously central to assisting the review process. You need the possibility for these people to be there for 4 years, up to 4 years, discretion of the Trust, so that they can make, one, a meaningful contribution, And two, if somebody of distinction is going to give their time to the trust, they recognise they can do so only over a 2, 3, 4 year period. So I'm perfectly content. It adds to the strength and skills at board level.
Well, I take the point that 4 years whizzes by. And the trust is suggesting to extend the maximum term of co-opted membership to 4 years because it could increase the likelihood of getting more suitable and better candidates. To your knowledge, has there been a lack of suitable candidates available for co-option, and are there other ways to ensure that the required expertise and skills are available to the trust rather than simply by extending the length of the term to 4 years?
There's an enormous affection for the National Trust in Scotland across the skills sectors, be these finance, be they audit, be they general governance. People feel goodwill to the trust and they want to contribute. So I've no doubt a wide range of candidates of real distinction, James, are available to the trust. That's not, I think, an issue. Particularly once the governance reform process has gone through, people trust the trust in the years ahead. You can't, of course, bring every considerable interest or skill into the trust, or you're back to what it was before, the Byzantine structures. So I think your question is, for those areas where specific skills and interests are not represented on the small 15-member board, how do they interrelate with the trust? Number one, you'll have noticed that there are a number of local assemblies and regional fora, very real inputs there. And secondly, there's a plethora of organisations by interest in locality in Scotland, bringing in other organisations. That is where people can meet, bring forward proposals. Thirdly, the trust has moved properly into the age of new media. So these things, these ideas can be fed out to a wide range of interested people on a regular basis. And lastly, I think you'd find that both Ken Coleman and Kate Maver are good at listening. Their door is open, and if people want to push a specific interest, they will be heard. This is very different from the old system, James, where you would find a specific interest in staff, one individual member of staff, terribly knowledgeable about something, whose proposals were turned down by the board, who would then go to a representative member on the council and get them to re-raise and second-guess the whole issue, and you were straight into chaos territory again. So people are available. Trust reputation is such it will attract them. The key skills are the skills that are not already present at board level, and for specific interest outside, there are new communication structures, local fora in the trust, a plethora of organisations where these things can be talked through, and an open door from Ken Coleman. I think this is particularly important in Scotland, convener, because it's perfectly clear that the government are looking at the whole heritage sector. That's a matter for government initiative, and as previous committees of the Parliament have said, there is a case in a bit more joined-up working across the sector board, but the start point for that's not the National Trust. The start point for that is government.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If any members get any additional points on that? Again, can I just check with you, Sir George, that in terms of the bill that we've, as it says at section 2 on the co-opted members of the council, that the way that's worded with the new section 20 of the 1935 order fulfils this function of being able to have up to 4 years, 4 members, but a possibility of extra 4 years after that.
Yes,
satisfies all your. Thank you very much. Can I now turn to Jane Baxter for some questions on the abolition of representative membership?
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Sir George. Your review recommended that there should be no representative members on the Board of Trustees, and this change has since been implemented. Given that no representative members currently exist, is there, in your opinion, a need to include this provision in the bill?
The bill is to clarify the whole process and set it down so it's clear for people outside, so it should be included. Of course, under the schedule, while provision is made for representative members, it's up to the board, the council, to determine how many, and that number could be nothing, which in reality is what's happened to get the show on the road to push the process forward. But I think it's important that this point is addressed in the legislation because it should be as clear a route map for the future as possible and set down in legislation.
Thank you. And just to follow on from that. So, in recommending that no representative member should exist, your review suggested that there are better ways, and I quote, for ensuring coordination, expert advice and policy development at a national level. What alternative approaches do you envisage that the Trust would adopt in order to coordinate its policy development with other bodies, and are you satisfied that the Trust has achieved this?
Well, it's not just me saying this. If you look at Oscar's report, Who's in Charge, they make it very clear that there can be conflict of interest situations. In the old days, you know, when the Trust was set up, 35, communication was slow. It was by train, sometimes by telephone. The Trust had to build capacity. So there was, I think, a case in the 1930s for bringing all on board as the Trust was reaching its mandate and expanding. I don't think there's a case now. I think there are very real dangers of people from representative organisations, as Oscar indicated, being there not impartially, but being there to push a specific interest. And how can you do that in terms of due governance? So I'm perfectly clear that was right to remove, and the Trust has done the right thing. In terms of alternatives, I trailed that in some of my answers to James. Number one, the Trust has established a structure of regional fora and assemblies which are open to external bodies. Number two, there's a whole raft of pan-Scotland bodies, be it environment, be it wildlife, be it birds, be it bats, all the things the Trust does, in which people can get together at a cross-functional basis from other organisations. Number three, the Trust listens. It does. And reports from these joint working parties where they can get on with their bit without being challenged by other representative groups, which was the old structure. Am I clear that these can be fed into the Trust and listened to? Yes, I am absolutely. I am absolutely. And finally, as I said, in age of austerity, the heritage market isn't just confined to the National Trust. You've got Historic Scotland, you've got a range of other bodies at national and local level. There should be more joined up working there. There should really. And you might like to pursue that with me. But that is not a matter, I think, for the National Trust to initiate. That's a matter for Fiona Hislop and the government to initiate. And if approaches are made, I'm perfectly confident that the Trust, who looks to the whole holistic range of historic and natural conservation issues in Scotland, will be a very willing contributor. The question, I think, is the extent to which you can get more joined up working and savings between Historic Scotland, the National Trust, locals and others. The Trust most certainly would contribute to that. The key factor is get the governance in place so it's fit to address the challenges. I think it is now. There's an inventory of all assets and properties. There wasn't before, where people had little filing cabinets here and people had their own list there. So at least that is all in one common database. But an inventory is not an audit. The Trust, by the end of the year, will have gone through that in its property portfolio review. What's the significance of each individual asset? Right? That's maybe more of an art form than a scientific methodology, but interesting things have been done by the Trust here, which are possibly of international significance in judging significance. Then look at what has to be done. you know. Then produce an action plan. Here's what we'd like to do, cost it, and go on to then finally a proper plan for the building. There are significant issues to be addressed there. The Trust is now fit to address them, but in some of these areas I am quite sure there will have to be cross-sectoral working with other organisations in Scotland. That's not for me, that's for Ken Calman and friends. And the final thought I leave with you here is there's a confusion, I think, in the public mind between ownership and management. The Trust may own, but down the road, one of the avenues open to the Trust is it may choose to manage in partnership with Historic Scotland, in partnership with the Forestry Commission, in partnership with local authorities, in partnership with community groups. That's the interesting one, but the structure to address that, Jane, I'm fairly confident, is now in place.
That's very interesting and really useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do any other members have any questions? Can I just, again, to clarify in terms of the bill, you ended there, Sir George, talking about partnership, and presumably one of the ideas in the 1935 Act, where it had the list of the representative bodies, was to be in partnership, and we're now moving to a stage where we're actually not using Schedule 2 to bring it to nothing, but we're using an Act to end the ability to have representative membership. So are you confident that those partnerships will continue even though this legislation does away with representative bodies completely?
Let me answer that by giving you a small vignette of what was wrong. A representative member saying to me in the first week of my inquiry, those of us in the upper house, what? Those of us in the upper house have to look at specific interests and scrutinise the board. How can you have a parliament, said this person? How can you have a cabinet without having a parliament? And then tapping the nose, quis custodiet custodes. Now, how conceivably could you have special pleading from representative members which would challenge the board? It was a pagaille. That is now taken care of. The Trust is fit to play its part in broad heritage issues in Scotland, but it's done through the whole raft of alternative measures where people can contribute, come to a view, feed it into the system. But I'm suggesting to you, Fiona, in terms of the big picture in Scotland, my personal view is that's got to be fed into a wider framework than just the National Trust. It's a national government parliament matter, not just a trust matter.
Are we content? Can I thank you very much, Sir George, for your evidence on the bill, but also for your closing remarks on giving us more to think about beyond this bill on the governance of the National Trust for Scotland. Thank you very much for your time with us.
Could I just add one small footnote? Normally, of course, I would sit through the whole witness hearing, but I'm also an electoral commissioner and I've got an audit committee shortly, so if I leave, it's not for lack of interest. I will follow your deliberations with great interest and I wish you well on your work.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now we will suspend for a few minutes, allow the witnesses to change over. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Back in session for our second panel of witnesses on the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. oral evidence. And to this section I would like to welcome Professor Sir Kenneth Calman, the Chairman of the National Trust for Scotland, Mr Keith Griffiths, Trustee, National Trust for Scotland, Mrs Nicola White, Governance Manager and Solicitor, National Trust for Scotland, and Mr Gavin McEwen, a Partner at Turkin-Connell. Good morning, witnesses. Thank you very much for attending, and I understand, Sir Kenneth, that you would like to make some opening remarks.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to attend and to present a short statement. You've already introduced my colleagues. May I also thank Sir George REID, firstly for his report, Fit for Purpose, and secondly for his statements and comments today. This bill is the last part of a jigsaw in completing the recommendations of his review, and as he said very clearly, this is not the end of the challenges. It's important at the outset to restate that the purpose of the National Trust for Scotland is to promote and conserve our heritage, which includes its people, buildings, lands, gardens and wildlife. I should also note that Oscar and Michael Russell had both commented on the need for change in governance in 2009, and Oscar, as you know, has responded to this consultation on the 6th of March 2013, welcoming the provisions of the bill, including the abolition of representative members, and the bill outlined as a vital part of implementing the recommendations of the REID review. Oscar also agreed that it was appropriate to present the changes as a private bill. The Fit for Purpose review was begun in 2009 and published in August 2010, and the recommendations were enthusiastically endorsed by the AGM in September 2010, and as Sir George has said, 424 for and 2 against. Specifically, the AGM agreed to reduce the number of elected members on council from 50 to 10 and to delete the list of bodies entitled to appoint representative members. The implementation of the review began immediately, and a transition committee was established. Board elections took place and the new board met on the 24th of March in 2011, 6 months later. There were 46 candidates and 41,000 votes were cast, and the 10 elected members thus formed the new council. As I've noted, the Trust had the mechanism to implement the majority of the review's recommendation, including the establishment of the new board, through the board's power to make regulations under Section 21, as we've discussed. But the REID review acknowledged that a modification of the Act would be required to implement all of the recommendations and complete the reform process. This new council is referred to as the Board of Trustees, and that's noted in the second schedule revisions. The process to introduce the new legislation relevant to the changes proposed in Fit for Purpose also began. In Scotland and Trust, the National Trust for Scotland's magazine, in the summer of 2012, the changes were published and the consultation progressed. We only had 5 comments which came in from that, all were favourable. In the AGM 2012, the changes as outlined were approved by a very large majority by a show of hands, and there were only 2 specific comments raised. The first was, should we use the word the in front of NTS, so the NTS. And the second was in terms of the length of co-options, and there were 2 comments on that. During this period, as Sir George has said, there have been a lot of other developments occurring, including our new mission statement, implementation of a 5-year strategy, new portfolio review, which will be completed shortly, the introduction of local assemblies, which have been very helpful to us, reforming our regional groups, and, as we've already discussed, the importance of partnerships, and we can, I'm sure, discuss that in a moment. The process of drafting the bill proceeded, and a notice of intention was published in the Herald and the Scotsman in December 2012. The bill was introduced in this Parliament on the 7th of January, and its objective was to complete a series of changes in the way in which the National Trust for Scotland is governed, and the 60-day consultation period, as you know, is now completed. There are 4 substantive changes in the bill, one dealing with the transitional period. And this last change means that the President and trustees who are presently co-opted will not be removed from office if the current legislation proceeds, and they will continue until the next AGM. And the changes are the ones which we've already outlined. We'd be delighted to answer any questions and provide any further information you might require in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Kenneth. Again, a very useful summary of where you've been, how we've got here, and how we actually managed to do this. Given that, as the promoter of the bill, you've been able to implement many of the reforms of the REID review already without using legislation, and also by using Schedule 2 of the 1935 Act, can you just again clarify for us why this private bill is necessary for these options?
Sure. I think, first of all, Oscar have answered that too and said, yes, it is necessary. But just as Sir George said, it's important that these changes are in law and codified, because they could be reopened again. And we're quite clear, I think, that the bill, short as it is, will allow us to ensure that the changes proposed in the REID review will continue.
This is to make sure that, as you say, the last parts of
It's
the jigsaw.
The last part of the jigsaw, yes.
So on that, we're amending 1935 legislation. Was considered necessary that the trust was put in a statutory footing in 1935. Is it still appropriate that the National Trust for Scotland in 2013 has to be on a statutory footing?
I mean, that's a very good point. I think it's helpful that it is. But again, as Sir George has suggested, over the next few years there may be other changes in Scotland, and the National Trust for Scotland would want to be part of that discussion. What this does is finish one bit of work, but I think it does leave open the fact that other changes may well occur.
Ones that you envisage would need legislation?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Sir George seemed to think that this was possibly the end of the legislative process.
I think this is the end of the legislation process, but should other changes occur in Historic Scotland, for example, that might well we'd have to think at that stage. But I'm not ruling it out, but I hope that this is the end, certainly in my time as chairman.
Thank you. So I take it then that you don't envisage the need for any amendments to the bill?
No.
No. Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I then pass over, as you say, the different sections of the bill, and we'll work through them as we did with Sir George. James, Presidents and Vice Presidents.
Yes.
Sorry, James Dornan.
Good morning, panel. Can you explain what liabilities the Presidents and Vice Presidents would have were they to continue to be regarded as charity trustees, and why you think this is problematic?
Yes, if the President continued to be a trustee, it would be necessary for that individual to attend every board meeting, to be able to comment on every board meeting, and to take on a number of responsibilities. We feel that that's an inappropriate thing for a President, and indeed an honorary Vice President, to do. What this bill does is remove that responsibility and leaves the President, in the way that Sir George has already mentioned, in a different category as someone who is impartial and neutral and can chair the AGM without having a vested interest in what goes on. So it's, I think, a very good way of releasing people's time and avoiding conflicts of interest and avoiding them spending a great deal of time doing things that they don't need to do.
The REID review felt that it was inappropriate for the President and any Vice Presidents of the Trust to be party to the decision-making of the Board of Trustees, recommended they adopt a more impartial role, as we said. Since 2011, the President's taken on this new ambassadorial role, albeit informally. Are you content this interim measure has operated effectively, and have you assessed it in any way?
First of all, it has been very effective. We've assessed it in a rough kind of way by ensuring that the President was content with what was happening, and he was particularly happy. The Duke of Buccleuch, who was the President during the early periods, was fairly heavily involved. It was taking a great deal of his time. Now, when he gave that part up, if you like, had the time to do other things, much more in an ambassadorial role. And our current President, Lord Lindsay, is exactly the same. He can now take on a much wider ambassadorial role rather than having to come to every board meeting.
So the roles are sort of split?
Yes.
Right. Just finally, the post of Honorary Vice President was created as a workaround to ensure that post holders would not be subject to the rules for charity trustees under the 1935 order. What will happen to these honorary posts if the bill is passed and full Vice Presidents are elected?
Well, what has happened, and we've had discussions about this with the President, for example, the honorary presidents, just as, again, as Sir George has said, will have roles often in a geographical way. If the President can't make it, this is a really good role for a Vice President to thank a volunteer, or give a certificate, be part of an event going on, and it allows the presidential role to be expanded across the country, if you like, and spreads the load, and I think is very good for NTS membership to know that there might be a Vice President or the President attending one of their local events. So it's about getting more localism in, as well as having a high-level presidential type appointment.
Thanks very much.
Do any members have any other questions? I think that's covered that fairly fully. Can we go on to the co-opted members? And Jamie McGrigor has some questions.
Sir Kenneth, these are similar to the questions that I asked Sir George at the previous panel. But you suggest that extending the maximum term of co-opted membership to 4 years could increase the likelihood of securing suitable candidates for co-option. Has there been a lack of suitable candidates for co-option, and what evidence is there that more would come forward if the membership term is increased?
I think the answer to that is partly the one that Sir George has already given, but I think there's a slightly different take on it. One of the reasons there are co-opted members is to ensure that we have people who fit the little bits that are missing within the board. So we haven't, in a sense, advertised, if you'd like to be a co-opted member, please apply. What we've done is look for specific people with specific skills. If you just take two at the moment, Ian Percy, who has tremendous financial experience, we needed somebody early on, to give the continuity with the REID review, but also to provide chairmanship of the audit committee. Ian's been absolutely splendid for that. He has stayed on. I don't think he would have given up if it was only 1 year, but I think he's very happy with that. And again, because his term of office will finish in about a year and a half, we're beginning to think already about who out there might fit that bill. The second related to some discussions we had in relation to Mar Lodge, a very important property of ours in the Cairngorms. Question came up, do we have someone with sufficient broad countryside experience within the board? Now, there are 1 or 2 people with that experience, but we thought it might be useful to find somebody who did that. So we went in a sort of search process around places, and we've now identified and found an individual who had his first board meeting in January. So we'll be looking for skills and niches, rather than just saying, would you like to be a co-opted member? And we'd never quite filled the co-opted numbers. As it happens, the chairman is a co-opted member. I didn't quite realise that when I said yes. But I think would make it easier for when I step down in a year and a half's time to find a chairman who might want to stay for 4 years rather than 1.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, have you considered the suggestion that was actually in the REID review that co-opted members could simply be elected each year or re-elected each year? And if so, can you explain what added benefit the proposal in the bill for the 4-year thing would bring?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have considered it, and at the present time, co-opted members are elected each year. But what it does is give a bit more certainty to the individual taking on a task. And our new member, starting in January, really wanted to know how long he was going to be there for. It's a big organisation, the National Trust for Scotland. It's spread all over Scotland. It's got a wide range of different things that it does. It takes you just a little while to come to terms with all of that. You need a year to get into place. If you had to drop off at the end of the year, it would be quite difficult. And I think the more we've looked at it, we think that a maximum term of 4 years, renewable if necessary, is appropriate. We could, of course, and it might well be appropriate in some instances, to appoint somebody for 2 years. not 4. If there was a maximum, if there was a specific task to be done in which we needed some help, then that would be appropriate, I think.
Okay.
Okay, does anyone have any follow-up questions on that?
Yes,
I
please.
think Jean Baxter has, yeah.
I'm really grateful for you telling us that the chair is a co-opted member, because I've been struggling reading all this documentation to work out where the chair comes from. I've not been able to find any references to the chair, and I was beginning to think it was me, so I'm really relieved to hear that the chair is co-opted, and that's I suppose if there's a question about that, that would appear to me to be quite unusual. Is that something that the trustees decided to do? How did that happen?
I'm really not terribly sure, because I was interviewed. There was the usual advert, interviewed and appointed before all this happened. So I don't know who did it. What I've already made clear to my colleagues in the Secretariat is that come the AGM 2013, I will only have 1 year to go, and the Trust will have to consider what it does with the chairman in future.
Okay.
But at the moment, it's an appointed post,
Yeah.
but it's co-opted.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Any other
Yeah,
questions?
yeah, that's fine,
I
thanks.
think that does kind of focuses us back on the co-option, because until you said that, I don't think any of us were quite clear. So,
Most people have
interesting.
not recognised it.
And a chair for 1 year at a time. This now ensures that you're a chair for 4 years at a time, or could be. Thank you. But that leads nicely on, I think, to Jane Baxter talking about the abolition of representative membership.
Yes. Thanks, Convener. Section 3 of the bill abolishes representative membership of the NTS's council. Did you consult with the bodies that used to have representative members on the council, and if so, what were their views?
Yeah. During the process, and Sir George did much of this, they were consulted, and I think most of them realised that there were better ways of involving themselves. And I think one of the things that's very clear to me, this is not about abolishing external specialist expertise. It's about abolishing their role in the governance structure. And we continue to, in a whole range of areas which I can spell out to you, use specialist expertise from the representative bodies. But to do a task or a project, and that's been extremely helpful and very effective. And it's a much better way of involving them than bringing them to 3 or 4 meetings a year in which they don't have as much time to talk as I think we would like them to. So I think it's generally been well received, particularly if you recognise they're not abolishing the expertise, simply their position within the governance structure.
And do you believe it's necessary to legislate to achieve that? Because I understand it's already happened. So what added value does the legislation bring?
I think for the reason that Sir George gave, that this completes it, makes sure that it doesn't happen again and can't be reopened just within the trust itself. It is too important to leave it within the schedule, the second schedule, and I think that's why we're very clear to recognise that, to codify it, and that's why it's part of the bill.
Thank you. And lastly, I think I understand the direction of travel that's been outlined about how other agencies will be involved and how that expertise will be brought in. Is there anything you can tell us about what the Trust has done to begin that process in recent times?
Yeah, very, very much so. As I mentioned in my introduction, partnerships are very important to us, and increasingly so. And indeed, tomorrow we're having a partnership meeting hosted by the NTS, bringing together, I think it's about 20 organisations, both from a heritage side and from a countryside management side. And we had one about a year and a bit ago, extremely useful, sharing information, sharing experience, doing things together. And it might be helpful if I did give you 1 or 2 specifics. The first and obvious one is trees and rhododendrons. We have real problems with tree disease and rhododendron disease. We need expertise for that through the Forestry Commission and Scottish Natural Heritage. They've been extremely helpful with that. We've worked in partnership with that. Some of our lands are contingent, so it's really quite important that that's done. Second good example, I think, is libraries. One of the things that our properties have are some rather special libraries. This just happens to be the Livingston Room. And if you went to Blantyre, to Livingston's birthplace, you'd find it had a little library. It's not a big library, it's not an expensive library, but in the beginnings of the 19th century, for the weavers to have a library was important in itself. We've got libraries all over our properties. We need someone to bring that together, codify it. And our friends in the National Library for Scotland have been extraordinarily helpful. We have a person who does and helps us. Our volunteers do a lot of the writing bit, but we're beginning to get a national database of our libraries, which are very important. Another one, I think, would be in terms of Hill House. I don't know if you know Hill House in Helensburgh. Macintosh building, absolutely wonderful, but very serious problems outside in the Harling. And we needed to bring experts to help us with that. That's a task-based, focused group to try and sort out this fantastic property and to do the best for Scotland in doing that. And one last one, in Mar Lodge, it's right at the beginnings of the Cairngorms National Park. It's a tremendous property and glorious views. We found out that the Cairngorms National Park is providing quite extensive educational programs, which we should have been using. And very quickly you can see how that could be helped. I just happened to be in Loch Lomond National Park last week, meeting with the convener there. We have an app on how to get up Ben Lomond. Ben Lomond is ours, but it's in the middle of the park. And we're not sharing that in the way that we should. So all of these partnerships are, and it's the clearest thing for me all the time, is just how much we can and should share all the expertise that's around. One tiny last one, the House of Dun in Montrose Basin, beautiful house, lovely new pictures in it. It's part of the Scottish Wildlife Trust's Montrose Basin. And we're not really interacting in the way that we should. And the more we can do that, the better. So what struck me is just how clear the partnerships are. And with an enormous amount of goodwill in the heritage sector, because we're all facing the same problems. Can we do things better? And the answer is I think we can, and we can do it through partnerships.
Thank you very much. I think Jimmy McGregor has another question.
Well, just on the point, I know Hill House very well, and I agree with you, it's a complete treasure. Are you suggesting that there's duplication between bodies which needs to be sorted out in terms of educating people about what the Trust does and the actual treasures of the Trust? Are you saying that you're coming across things which can be used now, like the Cairngorm Parks education thing, or do you think that things exist which are actually have been there for ages, which are not being used well enough, and the modern governance of the Trust is actually beginning to show up?
I think the governance has changed a lot, and particularly the local assemblies that we've had. Again, a recommendation from the REID review. This brings us into the communities. We can hear things. There are people from other organisations quite often there who say, do you know about this, do you know about that? And that's the listening part. And part of our function is to listen to what's happening. And I could give you lots of examples of how I've heard things which have been extraordinarily valuable, which we can then bring back and see how it fits into the Trust structure. The smaller governance with colleagues like Keith allow us to do that much more effectively.
I think, Sir Kenneth, you knew exactly what you were saying when you used your examples. As an ex-librarian, I'm delighted to hear the work that you're doing.
Well, it's been a remarkable venture. I'm Deputy Chairman of the British Library, so I'm library through and through. And it's just brilliant to see how that's developed.
I think it's also an exceptionally good example of, you talked about partnerships, Sir George talked about partnerships, and why you need to do this legislative change, because when you look at Section 18, Part 2 of the 1935 Order, the National Library of Scotland isn't one of the people that had to be on your board. Yep. So I think you've given us some beautiful examples.
But they will be at our meeting tomorrow.
Because it's partnership.
Because it's partnership.
Yeah. So well, I think that's a really good illustration of exactly why we're having to do the work that we're doing. If I have one last question, and it's about, well, I actually have two. The name of the trust. Now, you've referred to Oscar's written evidence to us, and Oscar says it's not quite clear just how problematic the issue of the legal name has been in practice, but as the opportunity has arisen to address in the bill, you're going to change the name. You know, given that Oscar says not quite clear why you're having to do it, can you just tell us exactly why this is in the bill?
It's, I might ask my colleague to say a word on this too, but it's just so much easier to do it that way. We also want to make it quite clear that we are never allowed to talk about the National Trust. It has to be the National Trust for Scotland. And if you do that in the board, you're fined or sent out of the room for a little while. So it's the National Trust for Scotland, and I think it just makes it shorter and easier. And if we didn't have a bill, we wouldn't do it. But in the middle of the bill, it's convenient. Keith?
Thanks. No, we've had issues in the past where we're always very, very, I think paranoid's the right word, about people mentioning NTS in their wills and getting the name wrong and money going down south. And we felt that it was helpful to have this as a valid name, so that lawyers weren't getting into a twist about getting the historic places and natural beauty in and forgetting about Scotland. Interestingly, Oscar had NTS on their register as the National Trust for Scotland. We think because we were obviously taken over when the register was started from the Inland Revenue's list of charities. So I think Oscar were quite surprised. They said, well, we think that is your name already. So it's just to put the matter beyond doubt, so that there's no question that whether a will describes us as National Trust for Scotland or the full name, it's equally valid.
Yeah, Gavin.
One of the other points under charity legislation is that in a number of official documents, including the trust note paper, the full legal name of the trust presently has to be given. And that means that you have quite a cumbersome name to add. And actually, it will make it much simpler and easier if we can simply refer to ourselves as the National Trust for Scotland. So that will allow us to do that and still comply with charity law.
Excellent. I think that clears that up just once and for all, doesn't it? I have one last very technical question, which I think may be for Gavin McEwen, but I'll address Sir Kenneth. Section 6, interpretation in this Act. When you go through it, you've got the address, as it currently is, of the National Trust for Scotland. I'm just really asking, perhaps out of ignorance, is that appropriate in legislation? Because if you move, you'll have to come back and we'll have to amend the legislation.
It's there in the interpretation clause simply as a designation to help to identify the trust, but conceivably the address could be dropped because we have the legal name of the trust and we have its charity number. So the address could be dropped from the interpretation clause.
Thank you very much. I'm very pedantic, but I do have to ask these questions. Can I ask members if you have any other questions? Can I ask Sir Kenneth and his panel if you have anything else you wish to draw to our attention?
The only thing has been very helpful, this conversation. If you do require any further information, very happy to provide anything in writing to you.
Great. Thank you very much. At this point then, can I thank our witnesses very much for attending, and given that we have agreed to go into private session, I now suspend this meeting of the committee. Thank you very much.